Hello and welcome to the second presentation for week 1, operationalizing. I'm Dr. Vincenzo Sainato, and so far we've looked at some very fundamental ideas of what science is, the difference between science and other ways of looking at the world, philosophy, ideology, etc. And in this presentation we're going to build on some of our understanding of different empirical modes or different empirical sort of constraints and look at some of the realities of how those things are put into practice a little bit. And then the next couple presentations are going to, each one incrementally is going to take that a step further, a step further, a step further. So the first idea is the concept of a model. And a model can be viewed as a likeness of something, or it is an abstraction, or a representation in some way of reality. They can delineate certain aspects of the real world as being relevant to the problem under investigation. They make explicit the significant relationships among the aspects, and they make it possible to formulate empirically testable propositions regarding the nature of these relationships. Basically tools for explanation and predicting. Now the thing is about models is they can be mathematical models, and when we get to our data analysis class in the third semester, we'll actually use some models for decision making using statistical analysis. But they don't necessarily have to be statistical models. They can be a mannequin as a model. And what we will frequently do when using models is use the model as sort of what we'll later learn to call an ideal type, although it doesn't have to be ideal in the way we normally use ideal, but a type, something to compare to assess the gaps, to do a gap analysis between what the model suggests the relationship should be, and then use it as a touchstone or a baseline to assess what the reality is at. Beyond models, or different from models really, are concepts. And concepts are an abstraction representing an object, a property of an object, a certain phenomenon, and they serve a number of important functions in social science research. Number one, they are a foundation of good communication. They frequently introduce a point of view, a way of looking at empirical phenomenon, typically with some kind of narrative that people can understand, and I'll show you an example here in a few slides. They are frequently a means for classification and generalization, and they serve as components of theories and thus are subsumed into the possibility of both explanation as well as predicting. While the underlying purpose of conceptual definitions is to provide clarity, there's a couple things we need to appreciate. One, first off, conceptual definitions are neither true nor false. Their purpose is to enhance the communication. Beyond that, they aren't tautological, meaning they're not circular. Okay, it's not A is A, or why did you do that? Because that's not an art. That's not an explanation. That doesn't define anything. That just sends people into a circle. Importantly, though, they express or delineate unique attributes or qualities of what is being defined. They also state in positive terms, meaning we say what it is rather than what it is not. And they should purposefully use clear terms. There are essentially two different types of conceptual definitions. These are both discussed in the reading. Primitive terms are those in which there is a consensus over their meaning. Usually their meaning is conveyed by indicating examples, whereas a derived term are those that can be defined by the use of primitive terms in some way. Conceptualizing is the process of creating a concept, where we take a fuzzy and imprecise notion and we make it a little bit more specific. We maybe apply narrative to it, we apply our definitions and what have you. It can be something that's very high level, like for example, when people frequently talk about surveillance, a lot of times they'll use an eyeball as a way of conceptualizing the notion of surveillance. Even though not every form of surveillance involves overtly watching people, it's a way of sort of hanging our hat or providing a narrative by which people can understand. And the next couple slides have a couple of illustrations sort of illustrating this idea. Like for example, you have the guy in the house, he feels he's being watched, and he kind of is, as you can see. He pulls the window shade down, and whoop, it's replaced by another eye. More practically, you deal with this every day. For example, if you have a DVR, which is a digital video recorder at home, it's most likely hooked up through your cable network, which means that they are constantly collecting information on what you watch, how long you watch it for, when do you watch it, do you DVR it and watch it later. all of that is a form of surveillance. You are being watched, although it's not with an eyeball, it's with a computer. Here's another example of a way of being watched. This is the Skywatch Tower. It doesn't actually shoot lasers, but anyway, I'm going to go on because that's probably getting really annoying. But this is, it's literally called Skywatch. Why? Because they're in the sky and they're watching. Here's a poster from London right after 9/11. They wanted to make everybody feel safe, so they used a variety of different public service messaging techniques, including these posters, and you can see the eyeballs have the logo from the London mass transportation system. It kind of freaked people out. They have one of the most comprehensive closed-circuit television networks in the world. They're called the Eyes in the Sky, but still, man, this kind of freaked people out. So, but nonetheless, here's a good example of that. Another example of surveillance, or another way of conceptualizing surveillance, is the panopticon, which you may be familiar with. It's a form of a prison where there was a tower in the middle. There would be a man inside the tower, or maybe not. You couldn't tell if you were in one of the cells, and the idea was that you were always being watched, or you were to perceive yourself as always being watched and modify your behaviors accordingly. Of course, most of us are familiar with the idea of Big Brother watching us. Of course, many of us are familiar with the movie or the book 1984, where the central theme was a society being controlled and people always feeling that they were being observed by the government as represented by Big Brother. Beyond conceptualization is when we get really to the heart of the scientific method, involves operationalizing. As I said before, science involves empiricism, meaning measurement, and logic. So assuming things are logically ordered, operationalizing is where we take our definitions and define them in a measurable way. Operationalizing or operational definitions refer to these set of procedures that describe the activities one should perform in order to establish something empirically, or establish empirically the existence or degree of existence of some particular phenomenon described by a concept. Operational definitions are a bridge between the conceptual, theoretical, and the sort of empirical observations we're looking at. Here's an example of a real discussion I had with a student several years ago. A student came into class and I said, "How many times have you been absent?" He said, "Well, you see what had happened was," I kind of got irritated, because usually when a student starts, you see what had happened was, I usually assume he's lying. And I said to him, "That's an answer to a different question." And he said, "But I have a note." Now, this was a stats class, so I use this as a teaching moment. I said, "A note? Thank you." And he handed me the note, and next time in class I came in with these slides, and I said to him in front of the class, because we were learning about operationalizing, "How can we operationalize note?" And he kind of looked at me the way one looks who hasn't been in class for 2 weeks, and said he didn't know what I was talking about, so that's too bad. And of course, we can operationalize note in a lot of different ways. Here's a note. "Miss you." Here's another note. Money is considered a note, or any financial instrument are also referred to as notes. Of course, a musician can play a note. And what I told him was I too have a note. It was called the syllabus, and here's a definition for a syllabus. But the important thing was that a note is an abstract thing until we operationalize it and give it a definition. Here is a sort of the standard way of defining surveillance by a researcher out of Canada. So even this definition has problems. It's much more of a concept than a definition, because we could go in and we could sort of beat apart. Well, what do you mean by focus? What do you mean by systematic? What do you mean by routine? And what frequently happens is, in the course of different researchers researching a surveillance concept, they'll take this definition and they'll take this concept and they'll apply very specific measurements of what they mean by focus, what they mean by systematic in their particular study, which could be different from how I might use the word focus or systematic or what have you. A couple of issues when going from concept to operationalizing. One is the congruence problem, and the other is the theoretical import. And I'll explain what those mean in a second. I'll do it right now. The two important issues that arise with the transition from conceptual level to the empirical observational level, meaning that which is in front of us. The first is the degree of congruence between conceptual and operational definitions. The second issue, theoretical import, arises when concepts cannot be operationally defined. In other words, they cannot be either directly or indirectly observed. Scientific concepts should not be evaluated only in terms of their observability, but also in terms of their theoretical import. That is, in other words, you might be able to observe it, but you may not be able to define it. Sort of like, according to the Supreme Court, what is pornography? I don't know, but I know it when I see it. Well, that's not really good enough. Okay, what does this all mean? Well, let's put some of this into practice. One thing that a lot of people find really annoying is that in our mass media, quite frequently, reporters don't know what they're talking about. I mean, how many times has this happened to you? You're reading the newspaper or watching the news or what have you, and some reporter's talking about something that you know deeply about. You're deeply informed of. Maybe it's because you were there. Maybe it's because you're a professional in the field that's being discussed, and you know absolutely that whatever they're talking about is complete and utter nonsense. Not true. They're not trying to lie, we assume. They just don't know any better. Now, how many times have you read an article, listened to the news or whatever, and you didn't respond in that way? I guarantee you there was somebody out there who was responding in that way. Probably many people. The point is that a lot of times what's reported in the news is, even if not trying to be, it is a distortion. It's based on the imperfect lens of someone whose job is to report rather than somebody who's an expert in a particular area. Let's take that to another level. One of my favorite topics that I find really interesting, it has to do with the concept of privacy. Now, privacy is a notoriously complicated subject. What is private, what's not private? We do not have a right to privacy yet, but we have an expectation of privacy in many aspects of our lives. So I want to illustrate, though, the purpose of this is to illustrate how somebody can operationalize or re-operationalize information or data, really, and completely distort the meaning of something. Let's take a look. Suppose you're watching TV, watch the news, and they said, this just in, a recent survey found that 70% of the people in the Bronx, New York, have their privacy regularly violated by the NYPD. Sounds very shocking, doesn't it? Well, a lot of times when you hear these pronouncements on the news, they don't give you any context whatsoever. And so you have no knowledge of whether or not, you have no way of evaluating whether or not you agree or disagree with those findings. Now, let's suppose that this pronouncement comes from the fact that somebody took a survey of 100 people in the Bronx. Now, by the way, I just made this whole thing up. This is just to illustrate the problem with believing or accepting that which you hear about in the mainstream media, or from anybody, really. Anyway, suppose somebody took a survey and they went around and asked 100 people, how many times in the last 12 months have you been stopped and frisked by the NYPD? Now, by the way, two things. One, who cares? It's only 100 people. That's not the point. In statistics class, we'll talk about whether or not 100 is enough people. That's not the point of this. This is just to keep the numbers simple. Secondly, to keep this nice and simple for those of you who are not in law enforcement, when we talk about stop and frisk, simply stated, it's when an officer stops somebody because they think a crime has occurred, is about to occur, or is occurring, and they can stop and they can pat somebody down for officer safety, see if they have any weapons or anything like that. So that's what that's referring to. Okay, now look at the numbers below. There was 100 people surveyed. 30 said that they had either 0 or 1 incident in the last 12 months. 23 people said it was 2 times in the last 12 months, etc. Let's go back to our news anchor announcement. 70% of people said their privacy was violated. Why is that? Well, that's because what they didn't tell you was that the researcher defined a violation of privacy being any more than 1 stop and frisk. So since 70% of the respondents said it happened more than once, it's reasonable for them to conclude that therefore the privacy of overwhelming amount of people in the Bronx are being violated. Of course, I would be suspicious of this. Forget about the fact that it was only 100 citizens again. The fact of the matter is that I could take that same data and show that 70% of the people do not have their privacy regularly violated. How is that? Well, okay, let's go back to the data once again. I'm going to operationalize a violation of someone's privacy as having more than 3 incidents where they've been stopped and frisked in a 12-month period. Look at that. I can turn around, take that same data, slice it in a different way, reoperationalize what a violation of privacy is, and come up with a completely different announcement. And if you don't think that that's possible with a lot of research, well, it is. Let's just keep it that way. All right. That's pretty sweet, isn't it? We've learned so much. We've come really far in our understanding of some basic empirical concepts, and now we're going to build on those a little bit. Before we do, just so you know, based on some of the things that we talked about in this presentation, we've thrown some interesting articles up on Blackboard. Here's a few of them. There's been a lot of discussion actually recently in the last couple of years about whether or not stop and frisk, whether or not actually in the Bronx in particular, or in general, does the NYPD stop and frisk certain groups too much? And there was a very thorough assessment of that, which is the RAND study. And as it turned out, no, actually the stop and frisks were related to calls for service. So then the people who were arguing that the NYPD was racist said, well, now we're going to have another lawsuit to say you can't keep this stop and frisk data. You can argue the ideological reasons for that second lawsuit on your own.